This is the 7th decade we're looking at of 100 years in the United Church. If you're looking for the first 6 decades, they are on our website, and you can go back and have a look. Every month, we're looking at church life in the context of Canada's life. We're looking at Indigenous connections, one publication the church wanted people to read, and a hymn written in the era. 85 to 95 was a decade of incredible change and challenge. As painful and destructive as the previous decade had been, this decade came with signs of real hope. The Berlin Wall fell, the wall that had divided Germany since the beginning of the Cold War in 1961, and it allowed people who'd been brutally separated for generations to come together again. The Soviet Union also broke up. Communist control was destabilized by economic pressure, overextended military, and Gorbachev's reforms that allowed multiple parties to offer leadership and opened the door, a crack for democracy. The center did not hold. Apartheid ended in South Africa, with a system of racial segregation harshly enforced and monitored. The black majority and colored people were allowed to vote, and it led to the formation of a democratic government in '94. In Canada, freedom for some meant losses for others. Tensions exploded over the proposed development and encroachment on disputed Indigenous land. The community of Kanesatake, near the village of Oka, Quebec, was a scene of a 78-day standoff when the Mohawk people resisted the expansion and development of a golf course and luxury condominiums on land that included a burial ground. Their protests led to violent confrontations with the Quebec police, the RCMP, and eventually the Canadian Army. Depending on perspective, some people called this the Oka crisis. Others called it the Ganawage resistance. The United Church had made an apology to Indigenous people of Canada for our part in the pain and destruction of Native culture, traditions, and well-being. That apology was received, and 2 years later in this era, Edith Memnook brought an official response from the All-Native Circle Conference in the United Church. And here is part of that response. They wrote, "The All-Native Circle Conference has now acknowledged your apology. Our people have continued to affirm the teachings of the Native way of life. Our spiritual teachings and values have taught us to uphold the sacred fire, to be guardians of Mother Earth, and to strive to maintain harmony and peaceful coexistence with all peoples. We only ask of you to respect our sacred fire, the creation, and to live in peaceful coexistence with us. We recognize the hurts and feelings will continue amongst our people, but through partnership and walking hand in hand, the Indian spirit will eventually heal. Through our love, understanding, and sincerity, the brotherhood and sisterhood of unity, strength, and respect can be achieved." The Native people of the All-Native Circle Conference hope and pray that the apology is not symbolic, but that these are words of action and sincerity. We appreciate the freedom for culture and religious expression. In the new spirit this apology has created, let us unite our hearts and minds in the wholeness of life that the Great Spirit has given us. And in this decade, Reverend Stan Mackay was elected leader, our spiritual leader, as moderator of the United Church. A wise and gentle man from Fisher River Cree Nation in Manitoba. He brought a strong and steady voice full of fire and light and love as our leader. A lot was happening in Canada at this time. Production stopped on the dollar bill and the dollar coin was minted. The back of the coin featured a bird whose call was known across the country in wilderness lakes. The coin was immediately and affectionately called the loonie. Less affectionate was the GST, implemented to improve the competitive position of Canada's economy. Dr. Henry Morgentaler became the face of the fight for legal and safe abortion care in Canada. With civil disobedience and protests in the streets, it was in this decade that abortion was decriminalized in Canada. Margaret Atwood published The Handmaid's Tale, a frightening story of a dystopian future where the religious right took over American democratic institutions and created a religious governing structure that controlled every aspect of women's lives and bodies. Canada and the US signed the Acid Rain Accord, noting the destruction of buildings and living things as a result of air pollution and particulate. 1984, Cirque du Soleil was founded, a traveling circus of acrobats that became a global phenomenon. Expo 86 brought the world to Vancouver with the theme of transportation. And in a party mood, Calgary followed with the 88 Winter Olympics. We made computers portable. The laptop computer became very popular. You still had to plug them in. They folded up like a suitcase and usually weighed 10 to 14 pounds. More than just writing documents and making charts, though, you could now use your computer to communicate with friends and groups of friends in chat rooms. You just dialed up, typed and shared your messages, and people waited for that exciting prompt, "You've got mail." And computer games and consoles came onto the market for something to do in your spare time. But all was not fun and games in this era. In 1991, a young man walked into an engineering class at Montreal's École Polytechnique, where he dismissed the men in the class and then shot and killed 14 female students and wounded 13 others. The massacre generated an increased call to action on the issues of gun availability and violence against feminism and women. A bomb in a suitcase detonated over the Atlantic Ocean, killing 331 people on a Canadian flight. An Air India plane headed for London. It was the worst terrorist attack in Canadian history. Canadian General Romeo Dallaire led a UN monitoring force in Rwanda. Upon seeing the rising levels of threat and violence, he asked and then begged for more support from the rest of the world. But help did not come. Ultimately, in a 100-day span in 1994, he and his command watched helplessly as an estimated 800,000 people died in the most brutal ways. In this time, the United Church was both modernizing and getting more traditional. In the earlier days, clergy preached on their preferred topics and their preferred scriptures, making individual choices. Now they were encouraged to follow a set of readings known as the Common Lectionary. Every week in the year was laid out over a 3-year rotation. When using the lectionary, it meant not only that you were getting an opportunity to address most of the Bible, but you were also studying the same passages as other United Church ministers, as well as the Anglicans, Lutherans, and Catholics around town. So it made for good ecumenical discussion. Everyone went to their church on Sunday, and they heard different sermons on the same scriptures. And the United Church started to pay attention to the seasons of the church year and adopted different colors to make them stand out. Both in the front of the church and the clergy, these liturgical colors were adopted. And we got a new curriculum. Starting in Regina, Saskatchewan, the Whole People of God curriculum was written by a group of Sunday school teachers and educators. And it rapidly spread across the country and then to 13 other countries. It wasn't flashy or slick with expensive artwork and cardboard cutouts. It was printed on blue recycled paper. But good theology, Canadian spelling, and context, and current events. It followed the lectionary cycle so that what the adults were hearing in church was what the children were studying in their programs. It had helps for ministers and organists, as well as stories, songs, crafts, experiments, and discussion starters. It was affordable and accessible, and churches and Sunday school teachers loved it and used it for years. And a publication that the church wanted people to read in the era was Gift, Dilemma, and Promise. It came out of a report on human sexuality called In God's Image, Male and Female, where the church of the 1960s was taken by surprise by conversations about sexuality in the culture. By the mid-80s, we were ready to talk, and we had done our homework. This booklet was meant to be a group study, and it had chapters on the meaning of sexuality, 2 chapters on morality and sexual relationships, one on marriage and one on intimacy. It had a chapter on sexism and a chapter on sexual orientation. And it addressed questions like these. What is it to live in a human body? What do we do with natural desires? How do we understand these powerful feelings in ourselves and others? What does it mean to act on those feelings? What if you work in an over-sexualized workplace? What is the value of sex education? What's the place of God and the church in the covenant of marriage? It talked about intimacy for teens, intimacy for those who live alone, celibacy, promiscuity, and where is God in all of this? In 1985, when I began ministry, very few couples ever lived together before marriage. By 1995, at the end of the decade, very few didn't. Sexual mores changed a lot in this decade. The final chapter in the book was on sexual orientation, and it opened scenarios for church people to consider in the lives of gay and lesbian people in their midst. Things that the majority of people hadn't ever talked about, and some of them had never thought about. Like, what kind of messages did gay and lesbian people experience? What kind of ridicule or welcome? What kind of trouble and support was in their lives? What were options for love? And what was the role of the church in advocacy, in pastoral care, and inclusion? What did the Bible say? And what did our understanding of God say? This little booklet invited people to think about sexuality with more complexity and more humanity than we had done previously. And it set us up to address the defining issue of the United Church in this era: sexual orientation. And could sexual orientation alone be a bar to keeping people out of full participation in the United Church? And could it be a barrier to keeping gay and lesbian people out of the ministry? That was the big issue coming to the gathering of the National Church in Victoria in 1988. It was so earth-shaking and rocked us enough as a denomination that for years we couldn't even use the words. We talked about the 88 debate or the issue. Were gay and lesbian people welcome in our churches? Welcome in the pews and welcome in the pulpits. A National Church Committee released a report called Toward a Christian Understanding of Sexual Orientation, Lifestyle, and Ministry, and its key recommendation that sexual orientation should not be a barrier to participation in any aspect of church life. A dramatic backdrop to this report in this era was the ever-increasing AIDS-related deaths in Canada and around the world. This devastating illness had been spreading exponentially in the 80s, disproportionately in the gay community, and there was still not a known cure or clear treatment options. Sexual orientation was a divisive, feared, and charged issue, sometimes pitting congregation members against their ministers, often against each other. There was moral outrage, tears, threats, and huge vulnerability for gay and lesbian people in our midst primarily, but for all the leaders in the church, both lay and clergy. And an interesting question arose about the role of general council of the church. Did this council speak for the church, or did it speak to the church? Could this gathering and its representatives across the country make binding decisions for all the United Churches? Churches from across Canada sent more than 1,800 petitions to the General Council opposing inclusion and acceptance of gay and lesbian people and urging the Council to reject the report. Some churches split, and there were arguments over property. Many members threatened to leave. Some left. Around 70 to 80,000. Clergy got burnt out and demoralized. Congregations received anonymous homophobic slurs and graffiti on their property. Our relationships with other denominations and other faiths were strained, if not broken. We were out there on pretty untested ground, struggling to be faithful. And we were being watched around the world for where we would land. It ended with a 7-hour debate ending at 1 a.m. when the final vote was taken, August 24th, 1988. Of the 388 delegates there, they voted 2-1 in favor of the report. That any worshipers, including self-declared homosexuals, could be full members of the church, which also meant they would be eligible for the ministry. 4 years later, Tim Stevenson, who spoke passionately at that council, was the first openly gay man to be ordained in the United Church. He was asking at this council, just listen to us. It was an era of profound spiritual wrestling, requiring us to re-examine what it meant to be the people of God. It put us through great instability, but it also taught us a lot. It taught us about courage. It taught us about love. It taught us about neighbors and inspiration and listening and pain and healing. This era taught us about God. There were so many good hymns and songs written in this era, and Bryn gave me a list of beautiful ones this week, and I chose one that speaks of God who doesn't give up on us, God who brings us through testing and troubled times. It's called Healer of Our Every Ill.